IVM।
भाई हम हिंदुस्तानियों को बतियाना बड़ा पसंद है। बंगाली में अड्डा, उड़िया में खट्टी, कन्नड़ा में हरटे और हिंदी में पुलियाबाजी। इस कला के लिए हमारी हर भाषा में एक शब्द है।
हम तीनों तो अक्सर मिलकर पुलियाबाजी करते ही रहते हैं, तो हमने सोचा आपको भी इसमें शामिल कर लिया जाए।
तो आइए प्रणय, सौरभ और ख्याति के साथ करते हैं पुलियाबाजी।
हेलो सौरभ, कैसे हैं आप?
एकदम बढ़िया प्रणय। ख्याति तुम बताओ।
मैं भी ठीक हूँ। तो कौन है आज हमारे मेहमान और क्या विषय पर हम आज पुलियाबाजी करने वाले हैं?
हाँ, एक हमारा चहेता विषय है भारतीय अर्थव्यवस्था के ऊपर। और वैसे हमारे 200 एपिसोड हो गए, तो 200वां एक एपिसोड तो थोड़ा मतलब ऑस्पिशियस होता है ना, तो उसके लिए किसी खास गेस्ट बुलाना चाहिए। तो हम लोग सोच रहे थे कि जैसे हम लोग अक्सर अर्थव्यवस्था के ऊपर बात करते ही रहते हैं, तो अर्थव्यवस्था के लिए एक बार जानने के लिए और क्या हमारा आर्थिक इतिहास रहा है उसको जानने के लिए एक बहुत ही जबरदस्त किताब आई है पिछले साल, जो हम लोगों ने पढ़ी और हमारे कोर्स में भी काफी लोगों ने पढ़ी, जिसका नाम है बैकस्टेज। और उसके ऑथर हैं मोंटेक सिंह अहलुवालिया जी। और हम लोगों ने सोचा उन्हीं को बुलाते हैं, क्योंकि इस किताब में सबसे जबरदस्त बात है, इतने सारे उदाहरण हैं, इतनी सारे एग्जाम्पल्स हैं जो हमें बताते हैं किस तरीके से हमारा आर्थिक इतिहास बदला है, क्या प्रॉब्लम था पहले के सिस्टम में और क्या सुधार हुए हैं वगैरह वगैरह। तो उसी के ऊपर बात करते हैं। आप तीन दोनों को क्या लगता है?
बहुत जबरदस्त विषय है और खूब बढ़िया रिव्यूज भी सुने हैं तक्षशिला के एलुमनाई से भी और बाकी लोगों से भी। और मोंटेक जी तो मतलब जिसको बोलते हैं बैक स्टेज, बहुत बढ़िया नाम है कि एकदम पर्दे के पीछे क्या चल रहा था। तो ये उनसे बढ़िया कौन बता सकता है कि पर्दे के पीछे क्या चल रहा था। तो स्वागत है मोंटेक जी आपका पुलियाबाजी में।
चलो तो शुरुआत करते हैं। मोंटेक जी, हम लोग सबसे पहले तो ये बात करना चाहते थे कि जैसे सरकार को ज्वाइन करने से पहले ऑक्सफोर्ड से ग्रेजुएशन के बाद आपने वर्ल्ड बैंक में अपना करियर वहां से शुरुआत की, तो ये अनुभव आपके लिए कैसा रहा और उसने आपकी इकोनॉमिक पॉलिसी की समझ को कैसे आकार दिया?
सबसे पहले मैं कहना चाहूंगा कि जब मैं ऑक्सफोर्ड में था, मेरा इरादा उस वक्त ये था कि वापस आके सरकार ज्वाइन करें, सिविल सर्वेंट के कैपेसिटी में थोड़ी पॉलिसी मेकिंग में इन्वॉल्व हुए, ठीक है। लेकिन फिर मुझे लगा कि जो हमारी आईएएस सिस्टम है वो स्पेशलाइज नहीं करने देती। मतलब अगर आप आईएएस ज्वाइन करो तो आप ये नहीं कह सकते कि भाई मैं इकोनॉमिक पॉलिसी में इंटरेस्टेड हूँ। तो मुझे लगा कि बेटर होगा कि और कहीं जाके थोड़ी इकोनॉमिक एक्सपीरियंस गेन करें, क्योंकि जो यूनिवर्सिटी में सीखते हैं वो तो थियोरेटिकल होता है। तो उस वक्त जो वर्ल्ड बैंक इंस्टीट्यूशन है, उन्होंने डिसाइड किया था कि वो काफ़ी एक्सपैंड करेंगे और डेवलपिंग कंट्रीज को असिस्टेंस देंगे, वहाँ टीम्स भेजेंगे। तो उन्होंने एडवर्टाइज किया कि हमारा एक यंग प्रोफेशनल प्रोग्राम है। तो मैंने और एक दो मेरे फ्रेंड्स जो ऑक्सफोर्ड में थे, उन्होंने सब डिसाइड किया कि चलो यहाँ अप्लाई करते हैं, देखें कैसे चलेगा। तो मैं सिलेक्ट हो गया। फिर मैंने कहा चलो पहले 3-4 साल वर्ल्ड बैंक जाते हैं, देखें वर्ल्ड में क्या हो रहा है। तो वो मैं जब देखता हूँ रेट्रोस्पेक्टिवली सो टू स्पीक, वो काफी फायदेमंद था। बिकॉज अगर आप अपने देश को ही देख रहे हो, वहां पे डिबेट्स हो रही हैं और इंडिया बहुत बड़ा देश है, तो इसलिए हम लोग ज्यादा इंटरेस्ट नहीं लेते कि दूसरे देशों में क्या हो रहा है। हो सकता है कि जो छोटे देश हैं वो उनको ज्यादा मतलब इंसेंटिव होता है देखने के लिए कि और क्या लोग कर रहे हैं। तो ओरिजिनली मेरा आइडिया था कि मैं 3 या 4 साल बाद वापस आ जाऊंगा। लेकिन फिर मैं ईश्वर से मिला, हमारी मैरिज वहाँ हुई। तो उन्होंने पीएचडी खत्म करना था, थोड़ा और टाइम लग गया, तो 9 साल हम वहाँ रहे। लेकिन हमारा दोनों का ये इंटेंशन, हमारी इंटेंशन थी कि हम वापस आ जाएं। तो जब मेरे फर्स्ट सन बॉर्न हुआ, तो ईश्वर की व्यू थी कि भाई बच्चों को अगर ब्रिंग अप करना है और अगर इंडिया में रहना है तो उनको इंडिया में ब्रिंग अप करना चाहिए। कोई फायदा नहीं कि बाहर रह के फिर उनको वापस ले आओ। तो हमने, गवर्नमेंट एडवर्टाइज करती थी पोजीशन ऑफ इकोनॉमिक एडवाइजर, तो मैंने अप्लाई किया, मैं सिलेक्ट हो गया, फिर हम वापस आ गए।
ये किस सन की बात है?
हम 1979 जून में वापस आए थे हिंदुस्तान में।
तो पिवटल मोमेंट एकदम, जब मतलब इमरजेंसी खत्म हुई थी और काफी जनरल माहौल भी बदल रहा था उस समय देश में कि इकोनॉमिक थिंकिंग वगैरह का, तो उस समय आपने टाइमिंग काफी क्रैक करी।
वेल एक्चुअली माहौल पॉलिटिकली काफी बदल रहा था, क्योंकि जब इमरजेंसी खत्म हो गई तो बड़ी पॉलिटिकल रिलीफ थी, क्योंकि बिफोर दैट टू मेनी रिस्ट्रिक्शंस वर प्लेस्ड। इकोनॉमिक्स में इतना नहीं बदला था। लोगों की उम्मीद थी कि मोरारजी भाई और कोई सोशलिस्ट नहीं मानते थे कि वो बड़े चेंजेस लाएंगे, लेकिन इस एरिया में वो सरकार बिल्कुल फेल हो गई। इकोनॉमिकली कोई सिग्निफिकेंट चेंज नहीं किया गया बाय दैट गवर्नमेंट।
अहलूवालिया जी, मैं एक सवाल पूछना चाहता था। जब आपने कहा ये आईएएस ऑफिसर्स के बारे में और तो कि इंसेंटिव नहीं है स्पेशलाइज होने के लिए, तो ये एक मेरे मन में ये सवाल था कि हम लोग अक्सर बात करते हैं जनरल इक्विलिब्रियम और पार्शियल इक्विलिब्रियम की भी ना, तो कई बार जो आईएएस ऑफिसर्स हैं वो जनरलिस्ट सर्विस हैं, तो ऐसी आशा रहती है कि वो जनरल इक्विलिब्रियम थिंकिंग करेंगे, शायद लॉन्ग टर्म व्यू लेंगे हर इशू का, ये देखेंगे कि किस तरीके से हर चीज दूसरी चीजों से कनेक्टेड है। लेकिन प्रैक्टिस में ऐसा नहीं होता, जैसा आपने कहा, वो एक स्पेशलाइज हो जाते हैं, स्पेशलाइज भी नहीं होते किसी एक एरिया में, और जनरल इक्विलिब्रियम थिंकिंग भी नहीं होती। तो ये क्या माजरा है? आपको क्या लगता है कि ये जनरलिस्ट स्पेशलिस्ट में हम लोग जनरल इक्विलिब्रियम थिंकिंग क्यों नहीं ला पा रहे हैं?
नहीं, देखिए, ये आपने जो ये पॉइंट रेज किया बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है, क्योंकि जैसे इकोनॉमी ज्यादा कॉम्प्लेक्स बनती है तो बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है कि जनरल इक्विलिब्रियम इफेक्ट को अंडरस्टैंड करना। जब मैं सरकार में था, प्राइम मिनिस्टर्स ऑफिस में, तो उनके आउटर ऑफिस में एक पोस्टर होता था जहां महात्मा गांधी की बहुत फेमस जो कोटेशन है कि व्हेन यू आर इन डाउट थिंक ऑफ वेदर व्हाट यू आर गोइंग टू डू, व्हाट इफेक्ट विल इट हैव ऑन द पुअरेस्ट पर्सन यू नो, एंड देन योर डाउट्स विल वैनिश। तो मैंने लोगों को कहा कि भाई इसमें जनरल इक्विलिब्रियम और पार्शियल इक्विलिब्रियम का बहुत फर्क है, क्योंकि अगर एक पार्शियल इक्विलिब्रियम अप्रोच लो तो आप जो भी पुअर पर्सन को दे सकते हो वही उसको फायदा होगा, लेकिन आप जनरल इक्विलिब्रियम अप्रोच लो तो आपको देखना कि और क्या चीजें होंगी जो उनकी लाइफ को इम्प्रूव करेंगी।
बिल्कुल।
गांधी जी ने ये नहीं कहा था कि पार्शियल करो कि जनरल करो, तो उन्होंने पॉइंट रेज किया था कि भाई आप सोचो उन पे क्या इफेक्ट होगा, लेकिन जनरल इफेक्ट, जनरल इंप्रेशन सरकार में ये था कि भाई एक्सपोर्ट प्रमोशन के इससे कोई ताल्लुक नहीं है। अगर आपने पुअरेस्ट मैन को क्या इफेक्ट होगा, अगर आप एंटी एक्सपोर्ट पॉलिसी फॉलो करो उसका कोई कनेक्शन नहीं। हाँ, फूड डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन, एम्प्लॉयमेंट, ये चीजें रेलेवेंट है, दूसरी चीजें रेलेवेंट नहीं है। तो आई थिंक दिस इशू, बट द इशू इज नॉट वन कि भाई जनरलिस्ट वर्सेस स्पेशलिस्ट, बिकॉज यू नो जहां पे भी आप जाओ स्पेशलाइजेशन इज इम्पोर्टेंट, और ये भी हो सकता है कि in order to be have a good understanding of economic policy, you don't necessarily have to be an economist. And United States में mainly lawyers हैं, लेकिन उन लोगों को ये पता है कि भाई देखो ये complex matter है, तो जरा engineers की भी राय ले लो और economists की भी राय ले लो। ये हमारे सिस्टम में नहीं होती, और जहां पे भी स्पेशलिस्ट है उनकी रैंकिंग बहुत लो होती है। अभी ये सब लोगों को पता है कि अगर आपने ब्रिज बिल्ड करना है तो कोई इंजीनियर को बुलाओ, पर वो नहीं सोचते कि मे बी इंजीनियर शुड बी इन चार्ज ऑफ द होल प्रोजेक्ट। जब छोटे प्रोजेक्ट होते हैं फर्क नहीं पड़ता, लेकिन अब बड़े बड़े प्रोजेक्ट जब आ रहे हैं तो इसमें फर्क पड़ता है। अब मुझे पता नहीं हमें क्या करना चाहिए। एक्चुअली वन सोल्यूशन, एटलीस्ट एज फार एज इकोनॉमिस्ट्स आर कंसर्न्ड, हम कह सकते हैं कि देखिए इकोनॉमिक्स, जो सरकार जब इकोनॉमिक्स करती है, इकोनॉमिक पॉलिसीज बनाती है, तो वो वित्त मंत्रालय में इम्पोर्टेंट है, इंडस्ट्री में इम्पोर्टेंट है, इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर में इम्पोर्टेंट है, ये सब। तो इन मिनिस्ट्रीज के लिए एक स्पेशलाइज्ड इकोनॉमिक्स पूल होनी चाहिए। आप रिक्रूट जैसे भी करो, कोई फर्क नहीं पड़ता कि 22 इयर्स में जिसकी बीए इकोनॉमिक्स डिग्री है वो इकोनॉमिस्ट नहीं है, लेकिन फिर आपने सिलेक्ट किया तो उनको ट्रेन करो, उनको पीएचडी के लिए भेजो, उनको स्पेशल प्रोग्राम्स दो, लेकिन उनको एक डायरेक्शन में स्पेशलाइज करने दो। मैं ऑफिसर्स को नहीं ब्लेम करूंगा, द सिस्टम एनकरेज नहीं करता, क्योंकि सिस्टम की, एटलीस्ट जब मैं सरकार में था, सिस्टम का अप्रोच था कि इकोनॉमिस्ट स्पेशलिस्ट नैरो होते हैं और जनरलिस्ट ब्रॉड माइंडेड होते हैं। इसलिए जनरल अप्रोच था कि भाई ये इस शख्स ने अब पीएचडी की हुई है, बहुत ज्यादा इकोनॉमिक्स होगी, इसको आप कोई जनरल मिनिस्ट्री में भेजो टू बैलेंस हिम आउट। दिस इज, यू नो, इफ यू आर डूइंग टैक्स पॉलिसी, आई मीन फॉर एग्जांपल यूनाइटेड किंगडम में जब टैक्स पॉलिसी बनाते हैं तो 3-4 डिफरेंट स्पेशलाइजेशंस को इन्वॉल्व करते हैं। एक इकोनॉमिस्ट नॉट द ओनली वन, also accountants, also people who have business experience, also people who have run the tax system, because after all you need to know what the tax system is and how it can be changed. और यूके में also a psychologist, वो इसलिए कि टैक्स पॉलिसी बड़ी कॉम्प्लिकेटेड सी चीज है, तो लोगों को समझना चाहिए कि भाई ये जो हम कर रहे हैं इसका ये इफेक्ट होगा। तो ये सब लोग मिलके डिसाइड करते हैं कि भाई क्या चेंज करना चाहिए, क्या नहीं चेंज करना चाहिए। हमारे यहाँ ये नहीं होता, एक्सपर्ट इन्वॉल्वमेंट बहुत ही कम है, और फ्रैंकली लीगल इन्वॉल्वमेंट भी जीरो है, बिकॉज हमारे अपने जो वेल नोन लॉयर्स हैं उन्होंने मुझे कहा था कि देखिए, यू शुड अंडरस्टैंड वन थिंग, सरकार कैन नॉट पे गुड इनफ लॉयर्स टू हेल्प इन ड्राफ्टिंग लॉ। जो आप सैलरीज देते हो, they simply cannot get good lawyers. Sarkar can get good economists, because economists don't have much of an alternative demand other than in think tank universities, not in the corporate sector. But you know, these are practical difficulties you have to face.
हाँ, नहीं, ये बड़ा दिलचस्प सवाल है, क्योंकि मैं अक्सर ये भी सोचता हूँ, जैसे डिफेंस के मामले में अक्सर बात करते हैं, अक्सर जैसे यूके वगैरह में डिफेंस के साथ एक डिफेंस इकोनॉमिक्स डिसिप्लिन भी होता है, जिसमें हम इकोनॉमिस्ट होते हैं, वो चर्चा करते हैं कि किस तरीके से इकोनॉमिक्स और डिफेंस इंटरेक्ट करते हैं। लेकिन मुझे नहीं लगता हमारे डिफेंस मिनिस्ट्री में, जहां तक मैंने पढ़ा है, कोई इकोनॉमिस्ट है या हम लोग इस तरीके से सोच रहे हैं। हम लोग सिर्फ बजट के बारे में सोचते हैं, लेकिन इकोनॉमिक्स वो एक डिसिप्लिन है जो हमें शायद जनरल इक्विलिब्रियम थिंकिंग लाए डिफेंस में भी। लेकिन पता नहीं, हमारे यहाँ पे सोचा कि इकोनॉमिक्स पैसे से जुड़ी हुई चीज है, और कुछ मामलों में पैसे से हम लोग तोल नहीं सकते चीज को, और डिफेंस एक ऐसा मामला है जो पैसों से दूर रखा जाना चाहिए। तो आपको भी ऐसा लगता है क्या?
इसमें एक चीज और ऐड करूंगा, एक और डिपार्टमेंट जहां पे स्पेशलिस्ट गवर्नमेंट ने ले लिए, जैसे रेलवेज है। रेलवेज में उन्होंने बड़ी अच्छी इंजीनियरिंग सर्विस बनाई, और शुरू से, क्योंकि कॉम्प्लेक्स इंजीनियरिंग प्रोजेक्ट उस जमाने में जब था तब तो और भी ज्यादा रिलेटिवली बहुत ही कॉम्प्लिकेटेड इंजीनियरिंग प्रोजेक्ट था। तो रेलवे में ऐसा नहीं हुआ कि आईएएस ऑफिसर्स चलाते हैं, अलग से उसकी कैडर बनी। तो गवर्नमेंट के पास एक सक्सेसफुल एग्जाम्पल खुद उनके पास भी है कि जहां उन्होंने स्पेशलिस्ट यूज किए और वो अभी तक चला रहे हैं। तो ये उनको समझ में क्यों नहीं आया?
रेलवेज की और ही प्रॉब्लम है कि वहाँ एक तो ये है कि वहाँ आईएएस ऑफिसर्स नहीं होते, मंत्री होता है, और मंत्री के बिल्कुल नीचे होता है चेयरमैन रेलवे बोर्ड। लेकिन उनकी ओवर स्पेशलाइजेशन ये है कि उनका कार्डर जो है मैकेनिकल इंजीनियरिंग, इलेक्ट्रिकल इंजीनियरिंग, ट्रांसपोर्ट, फ्रेट, ये सब में स्प्लिट है। और अब सिंपल चीज कि भाई डीजल लोकोमोटिव्स होने चाहिए कि इलेक्ट्रिक लोकोमोटिव्स होने चाहिए, दीज आर डिसाइडेड बाय 2 different fellows. ओके, अब उसमें एवरी फेलो वांट्स हिज ओन, द इलेक्ट्रिकल फेलो विल वांट इलेक्ट्रिक लोकोमोटिव. Economics though is a secondary order thing. I mean, I think there's too much over specialization in the railways, and they don't take an integrated view either. Now,
अच्छा
one of the problems railways में ये है कि for a long time, political motivations decide what the railways are going to do. I mean, for example, अगर ट्रेन चलानी है यहाँ से वहाँ, तो हर एक जो रास्ते में टाउन्स आते हैं, एमपीज तो कहेंगे भाई यहाँ पे भी स्टॉप करो, वहां पे भी स्टॉप करो. अब इसका नेट इफेक्ट ये है कि हमारी ट्रेन की एवरेज स्पीड 35 किलोमीटर पर आवर से ज्यादा नहीं है. ओके, अब हम अब ट्राई कर रहे हैं फास्ट ट्रेन. Problem is that you can have a fast train, but if there are other trains that are traveling in this ridiculous way, the fast train cannot travel fast. You need a system overhaul, and the system overhaul will require a recognition that some of these traditional ways of doing things have been wrong. And certainly every person should have access to a train station. But maybe in order to get to a train station, there's nothing wrong with taking a bus which takes you the first 20 kilometers to a nearby train station. Whereas the MP say, भाई लाइन यहाँ से जा रही है, तुम यहाँ पे स्टेशन बना दो. अब उसको इसमें he's not interested in what it will do to the overall speed
नेटवर्क.
और डिफेंस की जो आप बात कर रहे हैं वहां पे, I mean, for a long time, हमारी जो डिफेंस प्लानिंग है, it did not relate Army, Navy, Air Force in an optimal way. अब देखिए, मैं डिफेंस एक्सपर्ट नहीं हूं, लेकिन बड़ा इंपॉर्टेंट पॉइंट है कि इंडिया में आर्मी इज द सीनियर सर्विस, नेवी एंड एयर फोर्स आर जूनियर सर्विसेज. अब व्हाई इज दिस सो? This is so because during the British colonial times, we didn't have an air force, and they didn't want to give us an air force either. We had hardly any navy. Our main role was cannon fodder, how to recruit large numbers of people when there's a war. So naturally, the army was the most important thing. Up today, in today's age, wars are not going to be fought by hundreds of thousands of people crossing borders and occupying land. It's really the Air Force that will be the decisive projector of power. And in the Navy, with China gaining in strength, China quite clearly does not think that the Indian Ocean should be called the Indian Ocean. It should be called the Asian Ocean. Okay? They have the military strength to deploy a lot of ships and submarines in the Indian Ocean. If we were to work out a 10 to 20-year plan, because you need a 20-year plan, I mean, that's how long it takes to build ships. We need to totally rethink the allocation between the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. I'll go further and say something controversial. The armies should not be being used to suppress local dissent. That is an important thing for us, but the training of a soldier for war is totally different from the training of an armed police force. And the number of people that we need we need much higher quality of soldiers. We need fellows who can interact with drones. We need fellows who can deal with laser missiles and things like that. And most of the rest of the stuff can be done differently. When I was in Rajiv Gandhi's PMO, Arun Singh, who was then in his PMO and then went to be Minister of State for Defense, he had made the point that the Indian Army's what they call teeth to tail ratio is very low. That the number of people actually being trained to fight is a very small proportion of the number of people who are doing all sorts of ancillary activities like maintaining golf courses, looking after the colonel's lawn, and things like that. You don't need soldiers to do this kind of thing. I mean, I'm not saying that you shouldn't maintain the lawn, just outsource the damn thing.
मोंटेक जी, हम अभी थोड़ा सा आपकी बुक की ओर वापस आ जाते हैं. तो एक तो जब आप 80 के दशक में शुरुआत में जब आते हैं, तो उस समय की जो पॉलिटिकल और इकोनॉमिक पॉलिसी थिंकिंग क्या थी उस समय देश में, उसने आपने थोड़ी अपनी किताब में काफी अच्छे एग्जांपल्स भी दिए हैं. जैसे आपने एक एग्जांपल दिया है, इन्फोसिस को कोई एक कंप्यूटर जब इंपोर्ट करना था तो उनको एक लाइसेंस देना पड़ा, और फिर बाद में उनको जब तक वो लाइसेंस मिलता है तब तक कुछ समय तब तक ऑलरेडी एक बेहतर कंप्यूटर आ चुका होता है सस्ते दामों में, तो उनको वापस वापस उसके सारी पेपर वर्क वापस करना पड़ता है। तो इस प्रकार के आपने काफी एग्जांपल्स दिए। हम लोगों ने बस ये लाइसेंस राज शब्द सुना है, पर हम लोगों ने इसको एक्सपीरियंस नहीं किया है। तो थोड़ा सा उस समय की जनरल पॉलिसी थिंकिंग के बारे में और शेयर करेंगे?
या नहीं, जो आप कह रही हैं बहुत ही इम्पोर्टेंट है। और मेरे बुक मेरी डिसीजन बुक को लिखने की ये भी थी कि लोगों को पता होना चाहिए कि किस तरह की पॉलिसीज हम रन कर रहे हैं, इंटेंशन बीइंग कि समहाउ ऐसी चीज फिर ना कभी हो। तो काफी गवर्नमेंट्स कीप मेकिंग मिस्टेक्स, बट दे शुड मेक टू मेनी ऑफ देम। ओके, नाउ जो हम पॉलिसी रन कर रहे थे, बिलीव मी, वाज अटरली रिडिकुलस। और कई कमिटीज ने ये सब डिस्कस किया था, लेकिन हर एक कमेटी ने कहा कि ये बहुत रिजिड है, इसको थोड़ा रिलैक्स कर देना चाहिए। इवन द फेमस मोरारजी देसाई कमेटी, विच टेक्निकली जब आए थे आफ्टर इमरजेंसी, ये आइडियल सिचुएशन थी कि भाई ये पुरानी पॉलिसी बिल्कुल गलत है और इससे खाली क्रोनिज्म बढ़ती है, हम टोटली चेंज कर देंगे। तो उन्होंने एक्चुअली एक कमेटी सेटअप करी अंडर मिस्टर वादीलाल डागली कमेटी, और वो कॉमर्स मैगजीन के एडिटर थे। इट इज वन ऑफ द वर्स्ट कमेटी रिपोर्ट्स आई हैव एवर सीन, क्योंकि वो हर चीज को आइडेंटिफाई कर रहे हैं कि प्रॉब्लम है, और सोल्यूशन इज कि दिस मस्ट बी एग्जामिन्ड टू सी हाउ इट कैन बी इम्प्रूव्ड। उन्होंने ये नहीं कहा कि अब रबिश है, इट कैन बी गॉट रिड ऑफ एट वंस। एक्चुअली द प्रॉब्लम ये हमने जो ये कंट्रोल मैकेनिज्म इनहेरिट की थी, ये अंग्रेजों ने सेटअप की थी वॉर के बाद। बिफोर वर्ल्ड वॉर 2 ये कंट्रोल वहां नहीं थे। फिर डिफेंस ऑफ इंडिया रूल्स, फॉरेन एक्सचेंज स्कैर्सिटी, इंग्लैंड में भी यही कंट्रोल्स इंट्रोड्यूस कर दिए थे। वैसे तो कंट्रोल्स अमेरिका में भी इंट्रोड्यूस कर दिए थे कि गवर्नमेंट ने कहा कि भाई फोर्ड मोटर कंपनी की जो फैक्ट्रीज है वो अब टैंक्स बनाएंगे, बिकॉज ऑफ वॉर वाज गोइंग ऑन। बट दे हैड द गुड सेंस टू रियलाइज कि अब नाउ द वॉर इज ओवर, डिसमैंटल दिस एंड गो बैक टू नॉर्मल। हम लोगों ने नहीं कहा। अब हो सकता है कि हम लोगों ने सोचा कि भाई हम अभी पावर में आए हैं, अब हम इसको यूज करेंगे in order to develop. In those days, ये भी बड़ी silly sort of slogan थी that we must take up development on a war footing. Actually, it's complete wrong analogy, because the whole point of a war footing is कि भाई immediate war objective is the most important. Everything else is subordinate. You don't ask industry to do what is profitable. You just ask industry to do what is necessary. I mean, अब जब अमेरिका ने introduce किए controls, उन्होंने, I mean, they needed tanks, they needed aircraft. Up they didn't think कि भाई actually it'll loss making for the company. They said, never mind, we'll bear that for the 2 years or 3 years. Up to do development on that basis is a fundamental mistake, because it implies that the government knows what is best for development, which was catastrophically wrong. So, funnily enough, the argument that we should rubbish these controls never came. Now, one reason is that in those days, the left was intellectually very important. I mean, politically and intellectually. And the left globally was in favor of government control. After all, Soviet Union was the sort of exemplar of... Now, Soviet Union ने भी काफी achievements की, मतलब transform कर दिया. Russia was a backward feudal country. By World War II, they had defeated Germany. But the point is that they were able to achieve these things when you had a concentrated goal. They were utterly disastrous in pursuing civilian goals. This we should have realized, that this is absurd and doesn't work. Chinese ने ये avoid किया, क्योंकि Chinese ने कहा कि भाई हम global economy से integrate करेंगे, हम exports बढ़ाएंगे. तो if you're going to export, then you have to listen to the industry, because they'll tell you where the market is. You can't just have a babu saying, isko aap export karo. So I think we made big mistakes, and I think I've said in my book, in 1980s May, there was a realization that we needed to change. Mrs. Gandhi also realized, but the changes made were only incremental. Rajiv Gandhi structurally recognized that we need a system change. मेरी किताब में मैंने ये mention किया है कि February में पार्लियामेंट में प्राइम मिनिस्टर ने कहा कि देखिए, हम लोगों से, दूसरे देशों से कैसे कंपेटिटिव बनेंगे अगर हमारे सिस्टम 10 या 20 साल out of date. I think he's the first prime minister to have said there's something wrong with our system. Every other prime minister said, there is a problem, usko theek karo. If that requires some modification, modify karo. But even he failed actually bring about a system change. He made a little bit of change here and there, but he got overwhelmed with Bofors and other things. So that whole agenda got postponed. And it was only, I think, in 1991 that we made what I would call a radical break from past policy by indicating where we want to go, and by doing quite a bit in the first 2 or 3 years. And then I think we ran out of steam. I mean, this is a problem because, the initial years, we were facing a crisis. We were able to use the crisis to get done a number of things which many of us had discussed and written about. And I mean, it is fortunate that the political leadership at the time, Manmohan Singh as finance minister, Chidambaram as commerce minister, Narasimha Rao as prime minister, kind of recognized the need to get all these things done. But, every government runs out of goodwill after a while. And as the elections approached, Mr. Narasimha Rao was more obviously concerned with what's going to win votes. And, somehow doing insurance reforms doesn't win you any votes. Because you may announce the reform, but it takes years for the effects to be. And you're seeing that even today. I mean, for example, in now jumping another decade, in UPA, towards the end of UPA 1 and the start of UPA 2, it was decided that we need to bring in Nandan Nilekani to galvanize the Aadhaar system. Now, it took 2 or 3 years to be able to establish that the system can be put in place fast enough. Many people said, no. Initially, they said it should be done by the Registrar General of the Census, not by Nandan and his team. And that was the thinking earlier, because the only organization that used to reach out to everybody was the Registrar General. So their view was, look, you say what you want and get the Registrar General to do it. And I owe it to Nandan. He pointed out that, look, this Registrar General approach is totally wrong. We should have a sound system and persuade people that this card will be beneficial to them. And then allow them to get registered through a multiplicity of private organizations, but centrally directed by the UIDAI authority. Okay? This took, within the bureaucracy, this was not liked at all. Okay? And on many occasions, I told my people that, look, don't raise unnecessary objections. If you want to raise an objection, raise it on the file, bring it to me, and I'll overrule it. Because I've already decided with Dr. Manmohan Singh that this is a complex matter, which frankly neither I nor he understood. And if you've made Nandan the guy in charge of it, you're only putting him in the planning commission because you have to be in some existing ministry type situation. I'm telling you, whatever he says, I'm going to back. And Manmohan said, fine, that's okay. So, this overcame a certain amount of resistance, but not all. And it took 3 or 4 years before we had enough rollout. In fact, at one time, the arrangement with the Registrar General was that half the area would be covered by Nandan's team and the other half by the Registrar General. And if his system does better, then they can do the rest. But if Nandan's does better, then we'll shift this way. And of course, Nandan's did much better. So, this took 2-3 years. Then it took more years to get everything in place. Then you needed also changes in the Reserve Bank of India so that Aadhaar could become the KYC for opening accounts. I mean, the chota accounts. And earlier, it was impossible to open an account because you needed references, this, that, the other. So it takes a long time. And you're seeing the same thing today. For example, the IBC, Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. Now, this is entirely... It started with the present government. It's not a hangover from the UPA, but it took a lot of time and it still runs into problems, court delays, this, that, and the other. GST is another good example. Started by the UPA, brought in by the present government, took several years to stabilize. So I think when one when you look at it from a political point of view, you can sell a slogan, but if you sell a slogan the day before the election, the only thing that will be deemed to work is if it's a giveaway. If you sell a slogan that I am going to distribute 200,000 laptops to children, and you end up distributing 150,000, this could be probably done if you have the money and if they produce it in time and so on. But whether the laptop fits into an educational system which uses the laptop in order to increase education, that's a very different thing altogether. Mm-hmm. So from a political point of view, you need a lot of wisdom, how to do things, taking into account both general equilibrium and also the fact that results come after a long time, and a bit of political smartness. How do you sell it? Now the problem really is freebies are the easiest thing to sell. And if an existing freebie is there, for example, we have some good things like, social security payments, old age pensions. At the stroke of a pen, you can increase this by 10%, 20%. And from next month onwards, people will benefit. Most of the reforms you really need are the difficult ones, which, first of all, are difficult to design because of the general equilibrium problem. And secondly, their benefits will come after 5 or 6 years. So how do you put priority to that? Anyone who thinks that politicians have an easy job should think very seriously that they are underestimating its complexity.
अलूवाला जी, आपने एक बहुत ही अच्छी चीज बताई और मैंने आपके काफी लेक्चर्स में भी सुना है जो आप फ्रेमवर्क बताते हैं स्लोगन्स, टारगेट्स, प्रोग्राम्स और पॉलिसीज का, और किस तरीके से पहले ये सोच थी कि सिर्फ प्रोग्राम को बदलना है, पॉलिसी को बदलने की जरूरत नहीं है. तो इस फ्रेमवर्क के बारे में थोड़ा बताइए ना. और 1991 में कैसे बदलाव आया कि हमें पॉलिसी बदलना है, सिर्फ प्रोग्राम नहीं.
बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट पॉइंट आप रेज कर रहे हैं. मैं हर वक्त मैं 4-fold क्लासिफिकेशन मैं कहता हूं कि अगर पॉलिसीज को एनालाइज करना है, किसी भी पीरियड की पॉलिसीज, तो ये अच्छी चीज होगी कि आप पहले बोलो कि स्लोगन्स क्या थे, फिर बोलो टारगेट्स क्या थी, फिर बोलो पॉलिसीज क्या थी और वो प्रोग्राम्स क्या थे. अब रूल नंबर 1 is slogans are always good. From independence we are experts at making slogans, and that's good. And let me say that slogans are not unimportant, because slogans is what sells a policy. Whether you call it inclusive growth under UPA or you call it Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas under NDA, it's a good slogan. Or Mrs. Gandhi ne shuru kiya tha, Garibi Hatao. Now in those days, the dominant part of the population was Garib. Ab Garibi kam ho gayi hai, koi kehte hain 10-15% hai, मेरे मित्र सुजीत भल्ला कहते हैं वो 2% है. खैर वो डिबेट अगर 10 भी है तो politician cannot appeal to just 10%. So you have to appeal to a broader mass. So that's why inclusive growth, सबका साथ, so everybody in the audience feels कि उनके लिए कुछ, ये हो गया स्लोगन. अब ट्रांसलेट उसको करना पड़ेगा टारगेट क्या है. अब one good slogan for example is कि भाई हम developed country बन जाएंगे at the end of Amrit Kaal. Nice. I would also like that. फिर उसको अगर हम टारगेट्स में ट्रांसलेट करें, फिर इश्यूज आते हैं कि एक तो इज इट जस्ट जीडीपी. अगर जीडीपी है तो रिजर्व बैंक ने कहा है कुछ between, depending on how you measure it, between 7.6 and 9%, which is broadly I think correct. But लोग ये भी कहते हैं कि developed country is not just defined by GDP. It means everybody must be able to afford a healthy, decent standard of living. So that means सबका साथ हो, सबका विकास होना चाहिए. It's not just the GDP, or not just reducing poverty. Because poverty is bare survival. आप development कर सकते हैं जहां देश की per capita GDP काफी high है, poverty भी 10% से कम है, लेकिन जो सारी income है वो top 10% को जा रही है. तो middle 80% को कुछ नहीं मिल रहा. This will not be called a developed country. फिर education है, health है. So you decide all these things. अब इसको translate करने के लिए we should have targets. GDP is very important. Let's be clear. West में sometimes आप सुनते होंगे कि भाई GDP is not everything. That is true. It is not everything. But for us, it's very important. Not important for the West. I applaud the West when they say we want to downgrade growth. Europe और अमेरिका की per capita GDP को बढ़ाने की कोई जरूरत नहीं है. Actually, rest of the world will benefit if they get up and say, okay, we have enough GDP now, we are going for quality of life. So our growth target for GDP is 0. अब आप लोग GDP बढ़ाओ, that's good. I would support that. But it's silly to say that for India. We need a GDP growth. Let's have a target, whatever it is. आजकल अगर फाइनेंस मिनिस्ट्री को सुने तो वो कहते हैं 6.5 to 7 हो सकता है. Maybe that will not be as much as needed during Amrit Kaal to become developed from a GDP point of view, but it will allow a lot of benefits to occur. Then what are the other targets? Education, health, better infrastructure. These can be laid down. The moment you lay these down, these become the targets which many of them have to be delivered by the state governments and some by the central government. I mean, अगर आपका target है कि भाई movement of people, क्या नाम है, the new trains जो हमने शुरू किए हैं, हम इतनी trains introduce करेंगे, that's very good. लेकिन target ये भी होना चाहिए उनकी average speed क्या होगी. Because you can introduce the train and it can go along at 40 kilometers per hour. That doesn't help very much, right? So we should have these targets. Now the question is policies and programs. Now, मेरी fear है कि जब सरकार को कोई भी target दिया जाए, तो जो भी IAS officer उसको run कर रहा है, उसकी instinct होगी कि there should be a program. आपने export बढ़ाना है, there should be export production program. अगर आपने athletes को improve करना है, there should be a sport development program. But very few will say that we should change the policy. I mean, for example, take the railways. Why not introduce railway track is the job of the track maintenance and development authorities, a central government system, that's fine. But on the same track, you can run private trains. So why not introduce a variety of trains? There'll be huge opposition, by the way, from the railway unions. But then, public should be aware that, look, I mean, take the area between Bangalore and Chennai. आप लोग Bangalore में हो ना? So you are vested interest. Bangalore to Chennai, Bangalore to Mumbai. Now, these tracks, I mean, just imagine what would happen if the average speed of trains were to increase to, let's say, 120 kilometers per hour or 150 kilometers per hour. That's not a huge amount. I mean, these super fast trains travel at 350 kilometers. I'm just saying 150. It would, the number of hours that would be needed to get from Mumbai to Bangalore, if you count the fact that it takes 1 hour to get to the airport in Bangalore and another hour to get from the airport to the city in Bombay, and you're crowded, you're sitting in tight seats, whereas here you could take along your laptop, work on the train. They're a terrific signal to give. So the question really is, should this be done by introducing a public sector superior class of service, or should it be done by opening up the thing to the private sector? In my view, we should do the latter. Now that's a policy. Yeah. Same thing is in the case of Atmanirbharta. I mean, how much of Atmanirbharta are we going to do through licensing? And how much are we going to do by creating an environment where Indian products are competitive? अब अगर आप डेटा देखें, आरबीआई का डेटा देखें, तो जो हमारा रुपी है इन रियल टर्म्स अप्रिशिएट कर गया. रियल अप्रिसिएशन का मतलब है कि अगर रुपी 3% डिप्रिशिएट कर गया और इन्फ्लेशन 6% है, तो इसका मतलब रुपी 3% अप्रिशिएट कर गया. You cancel the effect of inflation, you depreciate the rupee. If you do some of that, and that's what we did in 1991, from 91 to 94, major change in the exchange rate, that's a policy. And it made it unnecessary to give subsidies and all kinds of other things. I think these are, slogans we are pretty good at. Targets we do have, but we don't have them very consistently. We should put them down. Then for each target, I personally think Takshashila should do this. That for this target, what do we need to do in terms of programs and what do we need to do in terms of policy? And many of the things that are needed in policies will actually affect all other targets also. none of the programs will affect other targets. So this is what a general equilibrium analysis of policy change will do. And you can see that will be necessary, let's say, in climate change. It's a no-brainer in climate change that we have to get out of fossil fuels. Okay, dominant fossil fuel that is causing the pollution in India is coal. Now, I'm very glad that in this respect, the government has set a target, net zero by 2070. And nobody questions that. I mean, everybody's trying to get there and so on. You can take it, consult the top 10 experts in India and also the top 10 in the world and ask them, if we are to get there, what % of our electricity will have to be based on renewables? And the answer would be maybe 95%. And today it's much, much below that. Okay. So the thing is, if our electricity is going to change that much, what are the structural changes that are going to be needed in the electricity sector to support that change? Now, if you give it to the program type guys, they will say green energy ko subsidize kar do, solar ko subsidize kar do, solar transmission ko zero cost kar do, all of which is imposing a cost somewhere else in the system, right?
Yeah.
But another approach would be that, for example, the biggest problem with the solar thing, solar, wind, etc., is it's intermittent. The sun doesn't shine through the day. And so the supply of this electricity kind of is up and down. The demand for electricity is more stable. So you need to do something to balance this off. A lot of that is storage. So you need major programs for storage, but programs for storage also shouldn't mean public sector programs to either deliver batteries or subsidize batteries. We should look at what are the policies that will encourage international battery makers to tie up with Indian battery makers to come to India and exploit this margin. Now, I can fully understand that we want some protection. So we'll tell everybody, look, 10% duty, whoever produces domestically will get a 10% benefit. But that should be it. Then, leave it to L&T and Reliance and Tatas and Adani and whoever else to tie up with whoever makes batteries to come and do some investment here. That's the policy side of the whole thing. So I think if in every major area, I suggest to Takshila that you identify, put up a wall, major targets that everybody will like. No, put up a wall of slogans. That should be, there's no difficulty. Let me, by the way, come to another interesting experiment, analysis. See, one of the most frequently quoted things is that right after independence, Panditji said, everything can wait, but not agriculture. A very good slogan. My view is that the policy we followed thereafter, except for the Green Revolution, systematically anti-agriculture. Because, until we started going for the Green Revolution in 1967, 66 or 67.
67.
The policy was protect industry. And to protect industry, effectively, you meant limit imports quantitatively or by tariffs, which actually meant run a highly appreciated rupee. If you didn't do these things, rupee would have depreciated. And agriculture would have benefited because agricultural exports would have boomed. When the reforms happened, a lot of people criticize us कि आप लोग तो से ये सब liberalization industry के लिए कर रहे हैं, agriculture के लिए कुछ नहीं कर रहे हैं. Actually, that was wrong. First of all, industry was opposing it. All the Bombay Club fellows, some industry was benefiting, some industry was unhappy. In agriculture, it has to be said to the credit of Sharad Joshi. He's the Shetkari Sangathan. He is the only politician of the time who analyzed things in general equilibrium terms. And he would say to me, he had worked in the FAO, by the way, a long time ago. Joshi said to me that you fellows think, when he said you fellows, he didn't mean me, but you fellows mean government of India at the time. You fellows think you're doing us a big favor that you're not taxing agricultural income. Actually, internationally, you're imposing a huge implicit tax on agriculture because of the high protection and the overrated exchange rate. So he said, get rid of this, and I don't mind, you can tax agriculture. I will willingly support you. In fact, he rightly pointed out that the exemption of agricultural taxation, the big vested interest behind it was black money laundering. 99% of farmers would have been below the exemption limit for income tax anyway. But every industrialist of the time would have a farm, and it would be easy to say, yes, I earn 20 lakhs from mangoes, on which I pay no income tax because it's from mangoes. And he was saying, look, get rid of all this nonsense, extend of course, central government couldn't have done it because constitutionally, it's a state government matter. Okay. But these are the examples, and I think Pranay's book has many, many more. And I really don't think it's a good idea or necessary to teach people good economics. I think it's much better to teach people bad economics. I was a member of the Growth Commission headed by Michael Spence, Nobel laureate economist set up by the World Bank in 2008. And I used to attend these meetings, and they produced the usual list of good policies, the usual World Bank list. I said, yeah, iska kuch fayda nahi hai, because everybody knows that these are good policies. What you should do is have a separate section on bad policies. So that, otherwise when a finance minister asks his finance secretary, bhai, is report mein kya hai? तो वो कहेंगे वो सब वही है जो वर्ल्ड बैंक कहती रहती है, ये करो वो करो ये करो वो करो, पर आप पता है बहुत मुश्किल. But if he could also say, oh, by the way, sir, इसमें 10 चीजें लिखी हुई हैं जो आपको नहीं करनी चाहिए. Definitely, finance minister would want to know कि वो क्या है. So I had given a list of those things. And Mike Spence said that was the best suggestion he had received in the Growth. Unfortunately, the Growth Commission report received no interest or attention whatsoever, क्योंकि वो report खत्म होने ही पे Lehman Brothers crisis हो गया. So the entire attention of everybody was shifted to how to handle the crisis, and this thing died a natural death. But the issue, I think, which is rather than teach people good economics, I really think people should teach what is the consequence of bad economics. After all, in the Hippocratic Oath, it sort of says, no, above all, do no harm. But the harm you can do is phenomenal. And I would really like a situation where everybody knows that the 10 warning signals, if you hear the government is doing this, watch out. There's going to be a disaster. So I urge Takshashila to get onto that program in a big way.
बिल्कुल, बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया इस सुझाव के लिए. इस पर हम लोग जरूर काम करेंगे. सौरभ, आप कुछ पूछ रहे थे?
हाँ, मतलब हमारी तरफ से नहीं, मतलब काफी हमारे श्रोता भी इस तरह से पूछते थे. बाहर से ना काफी लोगों को ऐसा लगता है कि भाई सरकार को पता ही नहीं है करना क्या चाहिए. अगर बस मैं ये बता दूं, उनको बस ये पता हो तो एकदम सब ठीक से हो जाएगा. लेकिन जैसा कि आपकी बातों से स्पष्ट है कि सरकार तो मतलब एक ऐसा अमॉर्फस चीज है, सरकार लोगों से बनी है. तो लेकिन आइडियाज तो होते हैं, बहुत पहले से सही आइडियाज हैं सरकार में, है ना. पता है कि क्या सही है या क्या गलत है, पर वो चीज होती नहीं है. अब ये क्योंकि आप एकदम जिसको बोलते हैं पर्दे के पीछे से आ रहे हैं बाहर, तो वो पीछे ये क्या माजरा होता है कि जब इतना स्पष्ट होता है कि ये चीज सही है, और काफी बार अच्छे से पता है कि क्यों सही है. हम दूसरे देशों में देख चुके हैं, अपने ही देश में देख चुके हैं, खराब चीजें भी देख चुके हैं लोग कितने टाइम से, पर फिर भी जब सबको पता है कि क्या सही है, फिर भी सही नहीं होता है. तो
नहीं, एक तो
ये क्यों है?
ये सबको पता नहीं होता.
अच्छा,
टेक्नोक्रेटिक साइड में भी डिफरेंसेस होते हैं. देखिए, जब हमने 1991 रिफॉर्म्स किए थे, डॉक्टर सिंह वाज वेरी कॉन्शियस कि इस पे चर्चा होनी चाहिए. ये नहीं होना चाहिए कि सरकार कह रही है करना. तो उन्होंने क्या किया, एक तो उन्होंने अपनी जो बजट स्पीच है उसमें 2 बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट कमिटीज एस्टैब्लिश करी, जिनकी रिपोर्ट इमीडिएटली पब्लिक में रिलीज हो गई, सो दैट जब हम उसको फॉलो कर रहे थे तो लोगों को पता था कि भाई ये है लॉजिक. और अगर ऑपोजिशन मेंबर्स इससे डिसएग्री करें तो वो पार्लियामेंट में रेज कर सकते थे कि भाई देखो ये जो तुम लॉजिक लगा रहे हो गलत है, एटसेट्रा एटसेट्रा. एक थी चेल्लैया कमेटी. अब देखिए, डॉक्टर चेल्लैया विदाउट डाउट एट द टाइम वाज इंडियाज प्री-एमिनेंट फिस्कल एक्सपर्ट. वो पॉलिटिकल नहीं थे, ही वाज नॉट विद एनी पार्टी. But under him, he put a whole lot of very distinguished people, economists, a couple of industry fellows, chartered accountants, कि भाई तुम tax reform पे एक report. Second, under M. Narasimhan, who had been governor of the Reserve Bank of India, he set up another committee कि भाई banking reform में हमें क्या करना चाहिए, अब तुम एक report बनाओ. So that report was produced and it led to some discussion and so on. So I think, what you need in government is you need more transparency so that the issues that the government is facing and the reasons why it is doing what it is doing are well established. Okay. This can be done. I mean, of course, in the old days, when we used to write plans and so on, this was part of the purpose of writing a plan, which was discussed, etc. But over time, would discussion become more weak? Because plan is too big, it kind of covers the whole economy. In fact, when I was Deputy Chairman Planning Commission, मेरे एक मेंबर ने कहा कि यार तुम प्लान मत पब्लिश करो, हर एक चैप्टर को सेपरेटली पब्लिश कर दो, because people will read it more easily. Because somebody is not interested in health but is very interested in industry. और जैसे ही प्लान का कि इतनी मोटी डॉक्यूमेंट देखते हैं वो कहते हैं नहीं I can't go through all. But produce a lot of small chapters, you will get more readers. I think he was right. We don't have any planning commission, but we have the Niti Aayog, which is meant to perform on the think tank side, meant to perform a similar role. I mean, I personally think that we need many more government documents, not just documenting achievements. That is also an important role. But documents laying out the rationale of why we need to do what we do. And on this, by the way, there will not be agreement. There will be many. The left was totally opposed to our liberalization approach. It just happened that politics moved in a way in which their importance declined. And once the Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991, nobody really wanted to look at the socialists anymore.
Right.
Now, so that those things happen. But certainly, for example, on some very important issues, like what should be the approach on bringing in foreign investment? Indian industry used to say, कि हाँ, आने दो, but they should be junior partners. But those fellows actually said, कि we can be junior partners if we feel that these chaps are offering us something of value. But if they're not offering us anything of value, why should we be junior partners? And part of the problem was that when you had a period of totally family-dominated business, the quality of management in the Indian companies was also family-dominated. So as a matter of fact, many of the best Indian managers prefer to move out of these companies into newer companies. And since the foreign guys were not imposing family relations, they found them a more competitive lot. So I think, and by the way, some of these problems only time will take care of. So one has to not be super smart, certainly not smart ass, know that, in any actual situation, there'll be some progress, less than you want, but is it enough? It's never perfect because you never get a perfect policy.
तो अहलूवालिया जी, हम आएंगे आपके एम डॉक्यूमेंट के बारे में भी और डिटेल में बात करेंगे, लेकिन उसके पहले आपकी किताब में भी लिखा है कि 80s के दशक में ही काफी सारे रिफॉर्म्स बनना शुरू हो गए थे, आप लोगों ने वो ट्राई करना शुरू कर रहे थे। जैसे कि एक एग्जांपल दिया है आपने, मारुति उद्योग जो सेटअप होता है, तो वो इतना सक्सेसफुल होता है, उसमें से क्या लेसन्स आपको सीखने को मिले पॉलिसी मेकिंग में पॉलिटिशियंस के लिए, जो बाद में फिर वो एक प्रकार का लोगों के माइंडसेट को भी चेंज करने में मदद कर पाया? तो उस पर थोड़ा सा और बता पाएंगे?
एक्चुअली मारुति, मैं समझता हूँ कि मारुति एक्सपेरिमेंट बहुत ही सक्सेसफुल था, लेकिन हमें समझना चाहिए कि क्यों सक्सीड किया। ठीक है, अब कोई लोग कह सकते हैं वो सक्सीड किया क्योंकि पब्लिक सेक्टर था, बट दैट्स नॉट रियली। कपल ऑफ थिंग्स। एक, आफ्टर संजय गांधी डाइड, मिसेस गांधी फेल्ट कि भाई इन्होंने कहा था कि इंडियन कार बनाएंगे, इन्होंने मारुति उद्योग शुरू की थी, it made no progress, but she said let us set up a public sector, nationalize Maruti, which had land and so on, and set up a public sector company so that at least an Indian car is delivered. A political objective. Secondly, उन्होंने कहा, ये बहुत important है, उन्होंने एक IAS ऑफिसर को नहीं उसका इंचार्ज बनाया, उन्होंने वी कृष्णमूर्ति को बनाया, जिनकी बहुत एक्सपीरियंस थी इन इंडस्ट्री, BHEL में, NTPC, ये सब, काफी सेल में भी थे। NTP ये क्या नाम है कृष्णमूर्ति रिटायरमेंट एज पहुंच गए थे, तो उनको वर्ल्ड बैंक ने जॉब दी थी कि वेरी गुड सैलरी एंड ऑल, वो जाने वाले थे। तो इंदिरा जी ने उनको बुलाया कि नो, कंट्री नीड्स यू, आई वांट यू टू सेट अप दिस मारुति। सो फर्स्ट थिंग इज she managed to get a top guy who was really competent to do the job. Normally, at the level of who is running it is not decided by the Prime Minister. It is told about, she tells the Cabinet Secretary, sets up a committee, they choose someone. This is her own pick. Krishnamurti said, first thing, Sanjay Gandhi said Indian designed car. It's not possible. Because starting from scratch, you cannot get to designing a car. But we can bring in a new design and create an Indian manufactured car in a phased manner, but I must be able to get a foreign partner. Mrs. Gandhi ne kaha, theek hai. Ye bhi left to itself would not have happened. फिर उन्होंने ये भी कहा कि प्रॉब्लम ये है कि मुझे फ्री चॉइस कोई नहीं देगा, जो आपके इंडस्ट्री मिनिस्टर हैं वो इंटरफियर करेंगे। और वही हुआ, क्योंकि जब वो मॉडल्स देख रहे थे, फ्रेंच कंपनी रेनो, उनका एक 1500 सीसी का मॉडल था, एंड उन्होंने मंत्री जी को कहा बहुत बढ़िया मॉडल है, दे ब्रॉट अ कार along, drive it. Obviously it was better than the Ambassador and the Fiat which existed then. और कृष्णमूर्ति की पॉइंट ये थी कि अगर हमने कॉस्ट इफेक्टिव होना है तो उसकी स्केल एडिक्वेट होनी चाहिए। He had said 100,000 cars at least. Okay? उन दिनों में एम्बेसडर की लाइसेंस थी 20,000 और फिएट की लाइसेंस थी 20,000 यूनिट्स। उन्होंने कहा 100,000, और उन्होंने ये भी कहा कि ये रेनो बड़ी गाड़ी है, इसकी प्राइस होगी 100,000, डिमांड ही नहीं है, so we want a smaller car which will go to 100,000. तो वो गए जापान। मिसेस गांधी ने कहा देखो अगर मिनिस्टर इंटरफियर करे, तुम राजीव गांधी इनसे बोलो और वो उसको बंद कर देंगे। So that is exactly what he did. He called up Rajiv Gandhi and he said, look, your mother promised me no interference. This fellow is pushing me to Renault. I think it's a bad idea. So Rajiv ji called up the minister, I won't mention his name, you can easily find out, and said, no, stop interfering. And immediately interference stopped. So all the bad things that happened to the public sector didn't happen to Maruti. He then went to Japan. I'm telling you a little in detail because people should understand the time period. He went to Japan in the early 80s, or Toyota and all were not interested. India's reputation in dealing with foreign companies was so bad. They said, no, we are not interested. This Suzuki was a cute little Japanese company which had just started. It was actually specialized in motorcycles. And it had produced its first ever car, this 800cc car. And Shrimati said, this is really what will work. And in his autobiography, he has written that, I also felt that Suzuki would be better than the other Japanese multinationals because when I visited their office in Tokyo, it was not air conditioned. So better cultural fit.
Yes.
When he went to Suzuki said, wonderful, we will give you a license. Krishnamurti said, I don't just want a license. I want you to invest as a minority shareholder. Now, India's reputation was awful, and Suzuki had no interest in investing. They wanted the project. They said, we'll send you the components, give you the technology, help you manage, but we don't want to invest. But Krishnamurti knew that long-term, to sustain interest, we must have the investment. So he got 25% subject to a maximum of 49%. Over time, Suzuki expanded the investment and the process of production began. Now, in the process of production, just like you have in PLI now, there was an understanding that phased manufacturing program. First year, 90% import, second year, 80% import, third year, you'll do this, fourth year, you'll do that. One of the things they had to do was to indigenize the manufacture of the engine block, okay, and by a particular time. So when the time came to indigenize that manufacture, Maruti said, that's fine, we worked it all out. In order to manufacture the engine block, we need import of the following machine tools from Japan, which are of the quality necessary to produce this engine block. Now, in those days, you had to get a license, so applied for a license. Before you got a license, the DGTD was asked, Directorate General of Technical Development, DGTD, an abomination which probably did more to harm India's development than almost any other organization. They were asking, should we allow imports? Isn't this thing available internally? So those fellows said, let us check with HMT, Hindustan Machine Tools. Hindustan Machine Tools, mein kya problem hai? We can give them the machining required to produce this block. We are, after all, producing machining. Our machines are being used by Bajaj Auto to produce their engine block. So then Maruti said, look here, Bajaj Auto is a very small engine. Maruti is a more complex engine. Maruti engine is small, but because it's getting much more power, the level of compression, etc., that it has to achieve is higher, which means more precision. These fellows can't produce what we need. Now, if Maruti had been a private sector company, this thing would have been rejected. They would have been told to buy from HMT. Because they were a public sector company, and because it was known that Mrs. Gandhi had a special interest in it, this matter went up to N.D. Tiwari, the minister. So I talked to R.C. Bhargav, current chairman, who was then the managing director. So Bhargav साहब कह रहे हैं कि जब तिवारी साहब ने मीटिंग करी तो उन्होंने अपने एक स्टाफ मेंबर को बजाज स्कूटर का इंजन ब्लॉक ऊपर ले आओ और मंत्री के टेबल पे रख दिया. अनदर ग्रुप को कहा कि हमारे मारुति का इंजन ब्लॉक लेके आओ, टेबल पे रख दिया. तो फिर मंत्री जी को समझाया कि देखिए ये लोग प्रोड्यूस कर सकते हैं, ये टोटली डिफरेंट चीज है, वी डोंट थिंक दे कैन डू इट. मंत्री जी मान गए. नाउ वेदर मान गए बाय रैशनल थिंकिंग or because he knew that Mrs. Gandhi was, after all, very pro the project, I don't know. But the end result is that they produced a first-rate product. So I think the idea that you go stage by stage is sensible. But in doing that, please rely on the producer and his guesses. You know, if you second guess the producer, it gives everybody in his team an excuse. When the thing isn't good, they'll say, "Saab, हमने तो आपको कहा था, आप वो machine tool लाते, ये नहीं होता, ये सब HMT का fault है." So when you give the guy that flexibility, then he knows he has to deliver. So I think that Maruti is a wonderful example. It succeeded, but believe me, it succeeded only because it was able to overrule the bureaucracy that ran the system. No other, even another public sector company would not have been able to do that because it would not have had the same access to Mrs. Gandhi.
और ये एग्जाम्पल ये भी बताता है ना कि कितने रिस्ट्रिक्शंस लगे हुए थे कोई भी मैन्युफैक्चरर पे कि अगर आपको एक वर्ल्ड क्लास प्रोडक्ट आप अपने हिसाब से बनाना चाहते हो तो आपको इतने सारे एक्सप्लेनेशंस और इतने सारे लाइसेंस के थ्रू जाना पड़ रहा है कि वो आपके लिए पॉसिबल ही नहीं था कि आप एक बेहतरीन प्रोडक्ट बन पाए आपके लिए.
सब बेसिकली पूछ रहे क्यों अच्छा काम करना चाहते हो. यही
कर लो. स्कूटर वाला इंजन.
आप ये बिल्कुल ठीक कह रहे हैं. मेरे ख्याल मैंने अपनी किताब में ये लिखा है कि मैं मेंबर होता था ये जो इनकी कमिटी डिसाइड करती थी कि इंपोर्ट लाइसेंस देना कि नहीं देना. तो एक बार मैंने उनको कहा कि ये जो टेक्निकल मैटर्स हैं, none of the other fellows is aware. जो लोग डिसाइड कर रहे हैं, they don't even know whether what is being imported is a solid or a liquid or a gas. I mean, this was because finance ministry's concern was कि भाई foreign exchange को कम release मत करो. They are not interested in the other things. There was one case, a fellow wanted to manufacture electric iron. तो इलेक्ट्रिक आयरन मैन्युफैक्चरिंग के लिए उसने कहा कि भाई आई वांट अ नाइस मॉडर्न आयरन. Indian nowadays, Indian professional women are also beginning to iron their own clothes, and indeed possibly their husbands and their children's clothes also. So I must have a light iron, and to have a light iron, I want to import steel sheets of this caliber, which is what is used in irons across the world. So this was being discussed. And people said, why? DGTD says not necessary because SAIL can provide sheets a little thicker. But क्या फर्क पड़ता है? थोड़ा ज़्यादा भारी होगा. And you know, if in the back of your mind you have the image of the ready wala with that huge coal fire, this will look very modern, but it's certainly not what you would get in a market in Dubai and so on. तो उसने कहा भाई देखिए, we must modernize, I must get this, I must show that I can make it good. It was rejected on the grounds that this is not for exports. If you do for exports, we'll allow. And this guy used to say, how the hell will I ever get an export order if I can't produce a product which is roughly appropriate? I cannot say to someone, I produce a 7 kg iron, but I can make it 3 kg because they will allow me to import steel sheets if it is an export order. Who's going to place an order like that? I mean, you know, it was, believe me, everything that can be said about this license permit Raj being a disaster was true. In those days, many people wrongly thought that the license permit Raj was a kind of negative term invented by foreigners. Actually, it was invented by Rajgopalachari. The term license permit Raj was first used in India in 1956 by C. Rajgopalachari, complaining about Panditji's belief in too much control, when he said, we did not get rid of the British Raj in order to subject ourselves to the license permit Raj. But most people didn't even know that this is a truly Atmanirbhar term. And the term of criticism used by foreigners.
तो ये बहुत ही दिलचस्प एग्जाम्पल था। और इस किताब में जैसे जो सीमेंट डीकंट्रोल वाला उदाहरण है वो भी मैं श्रोताओं से बोलूंगा जरूर पढ़िए। उसमें भी कई लेसन्स है कि किस तरीके से पॉलिसी मेकिंग होती है और ग्रेजुअलिज्म से चीजें बदलती भी हैं। तो आगे बढ़ते हैं अहलूवालिया जी। और आपकी किताब में भी आपने लिखा है और हम जानते भी हैं जो एम डॉक्यूमेंट था आपके नाम पर ही है शायद, जो जिसकी वजह से बाद में 1991 में जो रिफॉर्म्स हुए उस बहुत सारी चीजें वहां से उठाई गई थी। तो इस डॉक्यूमेंट की कहानी क्या है, क्यों आपको ये लिखना था, किसने बोला लिखना है, और इसमें जब आपने लिखा इसमें इतनी सारी रेडिकल चीजें थी तो उसका रिसेप्शन कैसे था जब आपने इसे प्लेस किया?
एक्चुअली इसकी मैं समराइज करूंगा। जब मैं पीएम ऑफिस में था, राजीव गांधी प्राइम मिनिस्टर थे, मेरे बॉस थे बीजी देशमुख। वो पहले कैबिनेट सेक्रेटरी रह चुके थे। He's a Maharashtra cadre IAS officer. Because he was a Maharashtra cadre IAS officer, Bombay में पुणे से थे, he had much more familiarity with the private sector. He had less socialistic prejudices against the private sector than all the other senior IAS officers, most of whom were for UP at the time. So we were sitting while the election was going on, and he had been very instrumental in getting some of the liberalization through. I mean, I would persuade him, and he would say, "I agree with you, and let's move forward," and he would support it. So क्या हुआ कि इसमें उन्होंने कहा कि भाई देखो, राजीव गांधी was not able to do जो सब कुछ करना चाहते थे वो नहीं कर पाए, वो पॉलिटिकल कंट्रोवर्सी। अगर ये इलेक्शन जीत जाए तो we must give him a full agenda कि भाई साहब right at the beginning ये सब करना। So he said, why don't you write one? So I started writing, but then of course election went the other way. VP Singh, I knew VP Singh because I had worked under him, not with him, but from the PMO. तो जब वो कॉमनवेल्थ हेड्स ऑफ गवर्नमेंट मीटिंग हो रही थी मलेशिया में, मेरे ख्याल 1990 में, तो वो जा रहे थे, तो उन्होंने, आई वॉज पार्ट ऑफ हिज टीम। तो जब उन्होंने देखा मलेशिया, तो हम गपशप लगा रहे थे, तो उन्होंने कहा भाई ये बड़ी अजीब बात है, क्योंकि मैं यहाँ आया था 73 में, 17 years earlier एज डेप्टी कॉमर्स मिनिस्टर। ये तो बड़ी स्लीपी सी टाउन थी कुआलालंपुर, अब देखो कितना मॉडर्न हो गया। तो मैंने कहा साहब बिल्कुल ठीक कह रहे हैं आप, क्योंकि मैं भी यहाँ 73 में आया था फ्रॉम द वर्ल्ड बैंक, और मेरी यही इम्प्रेशन थी। एक्चुअली जब हम पहले आए मलेशिया में, तो हेडलाइन थी डेंगी स्वीप्स कुआलालंपुर, gives you an idea कि वहाँ पे भी swamps थे, water था, ये वो etc. Completely changed. तो उन्होंने वीपी सिंह ने कहा ये कैसे हुआ? मैंने कहा साहब ये हुआ क्योंकि ये लोग रिफॉर्म्स कर रहे हैं और हम लोग नहीं कर रहे हैं. सो वीपी सिंह ने कहा अच्छा तुम वापस जाके ना एक नोट बनाओ क्या हमने करना चाहिए. So that note, what it basically made 2 or 3 points. Number one, the world is changing. Even the East Europeans, Soviet Union has still not changed. East Europeans have changed. East Asians have changed. They're all doing reforms. हम लोग नहीं कर रहे हैं. If we want to compete, we have to do it. Point number one. Point number two is don't do this by looking at individual silos because reforms are interconnected. You take an overall view कि भाई for the next 3-4 years ये हम करेंगे. उसमें मैंने mention भी किया था कि exchange rate के बारे में we should try some EXIM script type thing etc. Simplify import licensing, convert these detailed licenses into a license against an EXIM script etc. So VP Singh he read the thing उनको clearly उनको पता था कि ये reform agenda है. वो कह सकते थे हाँ leave it aside for a minute. लेकिन उन्होंने कैबिनेट सेक्रेटेरिएट को भेज दी विनोद पांडे भाई इस पे चर्चा करो विद द अदर मिनिस्ट्रीज. सो व्हेनेवर समथिंग कम्स फ्रॉम द कैबिनेट सेक्रेटेरिएट with the which has been referred by the Prime Minister's office, the presumption is that the Prime Minister must be in favor of it. But he never said anything to that effect. We had lots of discussions and somehow the paper leaked. When it leaked, Ashok Desai, the journalist, he gave a favorable review to the paper. He said it is being rumored that this is done by Montek Ahluwalia, but he is not admitting it. So let us just call it the M document. That's how M document came. फिर उन्होंने कहा the government's think tank papers are not bad. Maybe they should leak them more often. That also he said. The interesting thing was at this point, in the Economic Times, Indian Express, it started a huge debate. Lots of people wrote in, some critical, not so critical. But the dominant impression that you would get is that people thought that changes are necessary. They have disagreed here and there, but changes are necessary. And then, of course, in 91, all these things, I mean, they were within the civil service, it was very clear which were the ministries in favor, which were the ones against. Interestingly, the Planning Commission was totally opposed to it on procedural grounds. They said, how come PMO is writing such a paper? Hum to plan banane wale hain, it will come then. This is quite improper. They didn't say this is wrong, but they said it's quite improper. But I do feel that therefore, and by the way, this becomes even more so every day that passes, because worlds become very complicated and interconnected. I mean, today, for example, you cannot promote trade without a reasonable agreement on investor protection. Because if trade has become a global value chain, which is dominated by a few major companies, they will actually do investing in some parts of the chain, not necessarily all of it. They will only do that investing if they feel that the investment protection agreement is satisfactory. And there's a lot of, currently there's a lot of debate on our investment protection agreement, because our investment protection says that before you can go for arbitration in the event of a dispute, you must kind of exhaust all Indian recourse. This would be fine if we had a legal system which resolved everything in 2 years. But we have a legal system with 20 saal lagte hain. So, think of it, if you're a multinational and you say, I know that India is a good country. I know that Indians are smart because after all, they're running all the big companies around the world. I want to take some of my value chain into India. What do you think of investing $1 billion in India? One of the things they will think about is that I have no doubt that as far as the private sector is concerned, talent is concerned, very good. Also, no doubt that, if you have, that infrastructure is clearly improving. And when these fellows invest, they will go to where the infrastructure is good. I mean, they're not going to go to those parts of the country that don't have good infrastructure. So that's not a problem. But where they will have a problem is that if you run into a dispute with the government, then you cannot go to arbitration unless you exhaust all domestic remedies. All domestic remedies in India take 20 years to resolve.
Mm.
So they will say, look, you either take a risk, you trust the government, they won't happen, or this is a big issue. Now, if you're investing $10 million, it's not a big problem. But if you're investing $1 billion or $2 billion, then it can become a problem. And I think we have to think about, this is an example of general equilibrium also. In fact, our official view up to now, I'm sure they're thinking about it because this must be coming up before the Commerce Minister in these FTA negotiations. But traditionally, our view used to be that trade negotiations are about tariff and import quotas. Nothing else should be included. But increasingly, people are including other things. In fact, in the FTA, they're not willing to do an FTA unless you have decent labor standards, which has nothing to do with tariffs. Similarly, they won't do an FTA unless your investment protection is guaranteed, because a lot of the FTA stuff is related to global value chains. So we have to face up to this fact.
इसी से रिलेटेड आपका कुछ एक हाल फिलहाल की एक पॉलिसी भी उठाते हैं आपके कमेंट्स के लिए, तो जैसे PLI स्कीम अभी काफी पॉपुलर है और कभी कभी हम लोगों ने पुलियाबाजी में डिस्कस किया है, थोड़ी पुराने जमाने की पॉलिसीज की याद भी दिला देती है कभी कभी, लेकिन पूरी तरह से नहीं, कुछ वैसा है कुछ नहीं है। तो आप उन पॉलिसीज को किस नजरिए से देखते हैं आज की जो नई PLI स्कीम्स आ रही हैं?
गुड क्वेश्चन। देखिए, इसमें 2 डिफरेंट स्कीम्स हैं। एक तो PLI है, which is just production linked incentive. मतलब अगर आप प्रोडक्शन बढ़ा दें तो कंपेयर टू द बेसलाइन आपको इतना % सब्सिडी मिलेगी। ये सब्सिडी एक्सपोर्ट कनेक्टेड नहीं है, डोमेस्टिक से कनेक्टेड है, या एक्सपोर्ट या डोमेस्टिक। दूसरी स्कीम है कैपिटल सब्सिडी। That is not PLI, but just like discussion हो रही है कि maybe we will set up a fab. Government says we will provide 50% capital subsidy. They are 2 separate things. Now, I think on PLI, my feeling is I can understand that in certain selected areas where you want to make a start and you want to give a kickstart to something that is new, which is a way like Maruti was. Although it is not ideal to have these PLI type schemes, maybe one can justify a few of them, but certainly not 18 to 20. You cannot justify a PLI scheme for garments because this is the oldest thing in the world, right? If those things need an incentive, then the incentive is best done by the exchange rate, not by a PLI scheme. But I don't mind a PLI scheme for something new, some new electronics thing which we have not done before. But we need to be very clear that if you're giving a PLI, it should be totally clear that there will be no negotiation on raising tariffs. And you shouldn't have a situation where you first get a PLI scheme, then you start negotiating a higher tariff level, because there are 2 different ways of giving a subsidy. Second thing is that, a PLI scheme is a subsidy for an increment. It encourages the new industry to eat into the market share of an existing industry. An existing industry may have done very well and reach its limit. It wants to do something else. But by doing a PLI for some and you're not giving the same subsidy to these fellows, there is a unfairness. So I think the advantage of PLI is it's time bound. But वहाँ पे भी lobbying चलती है कि भाई अब extend कर दो. FAME 1, FAME 2, now there's going to be FAME 3. So I think this becomes a little bit, I don't blame industry for lobbying because that's their job. But you have to be quite clear what are the rules that you are following and when is it that you're going to agree and when is it that you're not going to agree. On the capital subsidy, I just don't know enough about how it's being done. What worries me is that you need a competitive process. Whereas the way it's being phrased at the moment is that anybody who comes in can come in and then negotiate a subsidy. Is that sensible? I don't know. I mean, the logical thing would be you clearly define what is it that you're giving a subsidy for. And, there will be efforts made to change that. I mean, for example, originally, the FAP subsidy was for up to 24 nanometers. That has now been extended. So, how much lobbying is allowed becomes a problem. Second thing is that if you're going to have a FAP subsidy, then maybe the best way of having a FAP subsidy is to do it on the basis of what they call a Swiss challenge. As a government has decided that for strategic reasons, we want a certain kind of FAP. There are only 5 or 6 companies in the world that do this, so we want to appeal to them. And one approach would be that you simply say, well, look, this is the subsidy. Anyone who wants it can get it. The other is that you say you can negotiate with those that are interested. The problem typically is that when somebody mentions a subsidy or conditions, people always change the condition because they say, no, this is not reasonable. 24 nanometers, or make it 48 nanometers, because after all, for many chips, you don't need these low-end, these very small chips and so on, all of which is reasonable. But I think the best way of doing that is when you've decided what you're going to do, make it a Swiss challenge. In other words, you say that, look, we have decided for this and this and this and this classification, this is the subsidy we are giving. Anybody else who wants with a lower subsidy can come and bid for it, can get it. That way you avoid the allegation that you didn't allow the first person to come in. Some people will go further and say that a Swiss challenge in which the original competitor is allowed to beat the next estimate. So the first estimate wanted a capital subsidy of 2 billion. You make it a Swiss challenge, somebody comes along and says, look, I'm willing to do it for 1.5 billion. Then you open it up to 6 people saying anyone wants to bid less. And so the person concerned can bid less. And if they bid less, then fine, they get it. But the first person who responded could be given the option to beat this newer bid by bidding even lower, as a sort of reward for having done the initial work. There are many ways of doing that, but the critical thing is we should try to have a system where if you're giving large subsidies, people think it was a competitive process rather than a negotiated process with an identified partner.
बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया अहलुवालिया जी। तो हम लोग अंत में एक सवाल अंत इस सवाल से करना चाहता हूं मैं कि समझिए अब सरकार सोचती है कि ठीक है आज के प्रोग्राम्स नहीं काम कर रहे हैं और हमें आज अगले 20-30 साल के लिए नई पॉलिसीज ही बदलनी है और सिर्फ प्रोग्राम बदलने से बात नहीं बनेगी। तो आपको क्या लगता है कौन सी वो 2-3 एरियाज होंगे या 2-3 ऐसी नीतियां होंगी जिनका हमारी अर्थव्यवस्था पे व्यापक असर पड़ेगा, जो कि डिस्प्रपोर्शनेट चेंज आ सकता है उनसे?
ये तो काफी मुश्किल, बिकॉज आप लॉन्ग टर्म फ्यूचर की बात कर रहे हैं, बट आई थिंक दिस इज एग्जैक्टली द सॉर्ट ऑफ थिंग दैट शुड बी डन टू ले आउट एन एजेंडा. नाउ प्रॉब्लम इज ये इलेक्शन ईयर है. You don't expect any political party to lay out an agenda which talks about difficult things. So the agendas that are laid out by all political parties now will be giveaways, freebies, whatever you like. But I think somewhere in the works, and this is what think tanks should do, somebody should say, okay, we have got together a lot of interesting people, including industry, and if you like, make a list of both programs and policies. I mean, using my 4-4 classification. I think most people would agree that setting a target growth rate of, let's say, 7.5% over the next 10 years, it's ambitious because the world is not going to grow as fast as it did earlier. But whatever the target you set, this will immediately lead to certain critical decisions. Okay? Decision number one, is the private sector going to lead in this, or is the public sector going to lead? When I say lead, the public sector and the government is not being wished away. It has a huge role to play in any successful private sector function. But it's not going to be the principal investor except in certain things. So what are those things? I think we need to be clear what those things are. I mean, my guess would be infrastructure is really what the government should be doing, both center and states. Health and education are things that the government should be doing, both center and state. And a little bit of social security for the weak and so on. These have to be done by the government. So lay out a program of what you want in this area. My guess is that if you lay it out, it will be very clear that you cannot reduce your fiscal deficit and at the same time achieve these increases unless you're willing to cut a lot of existing expenditure and raise a certain amount of taxes. So on the tax side, clearly, it's not that you add new taxes, but you certainly need to pursue the modernization of the tax system. And in that, I think fixing this GST, which everybody has now talked about, including the government, I mean, this should be on the agenda. Can we make the following changes? Number one, expand the range of products covered by GST. Number two, reduce the number of rates in the GST. And if so, do we do it all in one shot? Or do we do it over a series of steps? Whatever it is, government can take a view. A newly elected government can do that. No government going into an election is going to do that sort of thing. On the fiscal side, I think we need to be very clear. Are we standing by what we said earlier, that the fiscal deficit will be reduced from whatever it is, today's fiscal deficit is supposed to be 5.9%. I see from the newspaper, the government is confident that they can meet that. That's good. But the real question is, are we going to bring this down to 3.5 over the next, 3 years, 4 years? Now, there will be a tendency year by year to say why it can't be done in that year. I mean, definitely COVID was a good reason why it couldn't be done. But there'll be many others, so we have to be very clear. I think we need to indicate what is the scale of the fiscal correction that we need. Okay. Now, this correction has to be both center and states taken together. Probably at the moment, the combined fiscal deficit of the center and the states is approximately 10% of GDP. I think most people would have said that it should be brought down combined to 5% or so, which would, however you divide that between the center and the states, is up to you. But look at it this way. If the fiscal deficit is going to be reduced from 10% of GDP to 5% of GDP, that's a turnaround of 5 percentage points, okay? In addition to that, you want more expenditure. Most people would agree, number one, defense. I mean, you're doing less than 2% of GDP. That's not sustainable. You need major defense modernization, 0.5% of GDP on defense. On research, both center and states, including agricultural research, we are doing much less than other countries. So ideally, at least 1% of GDP on research. Now, how that research is done is another matter. I mean, it would be do you just fund your existing government research institutes, or do you create a competitive process where government plus private sector compete for funds? I would say the latter. I have no doubt that 1% should go there. That's 1.5% of GDP. Infrastructure development, including what is needed in the cities, to protect from the effect of climate change, this would be easily another 1% of GDP. So that will take you to 2.5% of GDP. And both for education and for health, easily another 1% each. So that takes you to 4.5% of GDP, extra expenditure. So 5% fiscal deficit reduction, 4.5% additional expenditure, 9.5% space has to be created. How much do you think you can increase tax ratio? Maybe 2%? Maybe 2.5%? The rest has got to come from squishing existing expenditure. And that inevitably means giving up some freebies of one kind or another, both in the center and the state. Now, frankly, it would be very difficult for anybody to present what would be a politically attractive way of doing this. The honest truth is there is no politically attractive way of tightening your belt. You can either fool people by saying, no, it's not being tightened, or you can persuade people that, yes, it's being tightened, but you'll see the benefits very soon. And you're lucky if you do see the benefits. But this is something, in my view, this is the biggest problem. And let me put it this way. If we fail to do this, I don't think you're going to get a revival of private investment because, the reduction in the fiscal deficit is what reduces the claim on resources which the government makes. The resources released is what the private sector will then get. If they don't get that, then forget about increasing investments. Some investment will go up, others will get squeezed out. So where are we? Today, our underlying growth rate is nowhere near 7%. It's probably closer to 5+. So how are we going to go from 5+ to 7 through higher investment? And that involves a fiscal correction. So this is it's a combination of programs and policies. Some policies and some programs have been cut. So you need to get it clear what they are. Third area is how do we integrate with the global economy? The fracturing of the global consensus on openness, and particularly the rise of deep suspicions about China on the part of both the US and the EU, have made these countries uncomfortable with a supply chain which is currently dominated in some portions by China. So they want to do a strategic diversification. I think they're making it quite plain that they're not trying to isolate China. I mean, they're not trying to cut garment exports from China. They're probably not even going to cut car exports from China. Certainly not utensils, certainly not refrigerators, that sort of stuff. Maybe not even printers. But electronic stuff, telecommunications, those things, they don't want that supply chain going through China. So two things happen. One is the closing down globally is going to be bad for global trade because by definition, you're reducing trade opportunities. But India could benefit because there's no negative about India. And if the supply chains are being refashioned, we would be at the top of anyone's list to consider. But I think it would be a huge mistake if we think that this is now inevitable on the grounds that they have nowhere to go. That's totally wrong. They can go to Bangladesh, go to Vietnam, they're already doing that. They certainly go to Indonesia, lots of other countries. So a number of countries will start competing for this reshifting of the supply chain. And for that, we have to persuade people that dealing with India will be easy. And although I think the government wants to do that, I don't know if they're aware sufficiently the kind of detailed problems that people face, in just doing ordinary things. And if we can demonstrate that that's not a problem. One of the ways that happens, of course, is that you bring in some international, players, and maybe even they get favorable terms. But sooner or later in India, the favorable terms get generalized. I mean, if you brought in Foxconn and you've given them favorable terms, somebody will definitely get up and say, boss, if they're getting these terms, why not me? I also need ease of doing, which is good. So sometimes I almost feel that bringing in a few high-profile players, a bit like the Maruti story, will draw attention to what is necessary for that player to succeed. And then the pressure will be, well, look, it can't be just for this player. What about me? But we need that sort of approach towards integration, which says that, look, we are in an opportunity, we have an opportunity to compete. And if we compete well, we could benefit from some of these global restructurings that are taking place. I mean, there are lots of other things to do, but quite honestly, that's a big enough list for the moment. If a new government were to come in and say, there are 50 things we have to do and we do all of them, but the big messages are in these three. I guess if I had to add a fourth, I would add climate change. Well, maybe there's lots happening, but lots more has to happen. One of the things we should start debating now is what is our view about a carbon tax. You know, we are resource constrained for all the reasons I said. If we want to shift from coal to renewables, why not impose a carbon tax? Now, we're thinking of doing it in an indirect way through this cap and trade system, which we don't know the details yet. That getting that right, yeah, I would add that as a fourth. If we do bring in the cap and trade system, which has now been legally made possible by the recent amendment, we should bring in a really classy one where people will say this is giving more role for the market and less role for license permit Raj. Remember, left to itself, it can become a massive source of license permit Raj, because each unit will have to be given an entitlement to emit. And does that mean we'll be back where we used to be? Or will there be a transparent system? I mean, a transparent system would be one, for example, where for an industry that is covered, we take a base calculation. What is the average emittance allowed or taking place per unit of output produced? Okay. And we use that as a grandfathered initial entitlement, but it's an average. So the fellows who are doing better than average will benefit, and the fellows who are doing worse than average will not. There'll be huge lobbying there. But they'll say, no, that person is using a better technology. Well, you should benefit from that, no? Second, if you're reducing over time, which is the logic, are you going to reduce it at different rates for different units? Or are you going to reduce it across the board equally? I think we should do the latter. So there are many very complex issues that have to come up, which I think will benefit from an open discussion. I'm happy to come to Takshila and I'm writing something on this. I'm quite happy to come and discuss what I think would be a workable system for the carbon market.
नहीं, ये तो बहुत जेनरस ऑफर है, हम इसको छोड़ेंगे नहीं। और जनरली मोंटेक जी, मतलब आज की डिस्कशन एकदम मतलब सुन के लगा कि बहुत बहुत सीखने को मिला। और आखिरी के खासकर जो आपने आखिरी सवाल का जवाब दिया, मुझे लग रहा है कि ये कुछ एक M2 डॉक्यूमेंट बन सकता है कुछ दिनों में।
It can't be called M2. The beauty of M document was it was by an insider. I'm not an insider now. If I write the document, it'll be my view. No ambiguities.
बिल्कुल। तो मैं अपने श्रोताओं से बोलूंगा, बिल्कुल बैक स्टेज पढ़िए, एक इतना बढ़िया इनसाइडर व्यू, और खासकर पूरी उस पीरियड का जो कि इतना चेंज का पीरियड है हिंदुस्तान का, वो आपको बारीकी से समझने को मिलेगा कि आपको क्यों समझना चाहिए और क्या हम आगे हमको नहीं करना चाहिए, क्या करना चाहिए और क्या नहीं करना चाहिए, दोनों ही चीजें। तो बुक हर प्लेटफॉर्म पे अवेलेबल है, हम उसको शो नोट्स में लिंक भी करेंगे, जरूर पढ़िए। और बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया आज की डिस्कशन के लिए। रेपुटेशन हमने सुनी थी, आज साक्षात देख लिया कि आपके साथ बात करके 1.5 घंटे में लग रहा है कि जैसे थोड़ा IQ लेवल बढ़ गया है। तो थैंक यू सो मच।
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed it. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
उम्मीद है आपको भी मजा आया। यह पॉडकास्ट संभव हो पाया है तक्षशिला इंस्टीट्यूशन के सपोर्ट के कारण। तक्षशिला पब्लिक पॉलिसी में शिक्षा और अनुसंधान के लिए स्थापित एक स्वतंत्र संस्था है। आप दुनिया के किसी भी कोने में हो, आपकी उम्र कुछ भी हो, अगर आप पब्लिक पॉलिसी, विदेश नीति या टेक्नोलॉजी गवर्नेंस में रुचि रखते हैं तो तक्षशिला की वेबसाइट takshashila.org.in पर उनके कोर्सेज को ज़रूर चेक कीजिए। और अगर आप पुलियाबाजी में शामिल होना चाहते हैं तो हमसे कनेक्ट कीजिए puliyabazi@gmail.com पर या फिर @puliyabazi ट्विटर पर। शुक्रिया।
IVM